very much, Jill, and thanks everybody for joining us today for the webinar. I hope it's valuable for everyone. We really obviously believe in this subject matter, managing IT vulnerabilities and dealing with the consequences. It's basically a reality today that this is sort of an ongoing concern with technology in general, and certainly with the stuff we touch. So it really behooves us to talk about the management process of these vulnerabilities because they're always going to exist. So we'll go through that today and then get a little of your feedback and go from there. So a little intro for you. Think about any kind of product you might own. So like a toaster or a television or a car or whatever, right? How foolproof are these devices? You know, even if it's reliable, you know, let's say, for example, the car, we still have to do maintenance on it. We have to put, do oil changes, change the tires, fix the time belt, do all that stuff. But you could also look at things like recalls. Besides maintenance, we also have products that are shipped with flaws in them. The brakes didn't work right, or we need to get the airbag looked at, or something like that. Or they just get iterated, and you get a new product that has something better, or has less flaws and things like that. Well, in many ways, technology products are even harder to manage these issues with. The car, as complicated as a car is sort of a known technology, a known solution, and a car is generally not on the defensive from people on the internet who are trying to, at least not yet, although maybe that will change in the near future. A lot of the times also, these flaws are not really known. I mean, if you consider a vulnerability like a product flaw, which is kind of how I look at it, we only know what has been identified as flaws. When you're talking about millions of lines of code in an application or operating system or something like that, being able to accurately know, especially at a product launch, what those vulnerabilities might be is unreasonable. So it's really important that we take an approach where we understand that these flaws exist and what can we do about them. So on the agenda today is we're just going to talk about how to manage vulnerabilities on an ongoing basis. And you can see one of our associates, Scott, there working on managing a vulnerability right now. So we're going to talk about things like supportable technology. There's no way to shield yourself from vulnerabilities or at least mitigate the risk of vulnerabilities without having technology in place that is supportable and manageable. A Windows 2000 PC, which maybe people on the line maybe not have even heard of, is not really a supportable technology. It's a product that Microsoft has stopped supporting. Anything that's wrong with it is, you're on your own. Testing and identification. So we've got these products in place, everything's supportable, but how do we know what's really out there? How do we know whether these devices are exposed or not? And how do we identify what those flaws are and how important they are to the organization? That's a really important part of this. We have to understand, and I'll get into this later, that flaws and vulnerabilities will exist. There is no 100% risk-free system, but we need to come up with a process to identify what we have and mitigate our issues so that we can at least be comfortable with our risk level. We're going to talk about patch management, because patch management, in terms of managing actual vulnerabilities on endpoints like desktops and servers and laptops and things like that, even mobile devices, patch management is critical because those patches typically represent the fixes to exploits that bad guys on the internet are going to take advantage of. Outside of patches, we're going to talk about other remediation. So when I do an external vulnerability test on the perimeter of an office, their firewall, or a web server, or whatever, we have remediation that really has oftentimes nothing to do with patches. Maybe it's a configuration issue. Perhaps the vulnerability isn't necessarily a flaw with the software, but how the product was implemented and designed. Two products are implemented in the way that seems right, but that synergy together creates a problem, things like that. And then lastly, configuration review, which I call the vulnerability of design and management. So you could create a very tight system, but if you give too many rights to someone or create a system where somebody who is not entitled to those rights has them, perhaps a third party. You allow the third party to gather data from you because you share information, you have a partnership, but then they have more information than they're entitled to, which has created a vulnerability on your end. We have to deal with that sort of thing. And then, of course, active defenses against vulnerabilities, things we can use to actually fight these things, some of which you may be familiar with, and others you might not be. We know we have these little holes in our wall, and what can we do to defend in case someone's trying to break through those defenses? And then finally, we're just going to do a little Q&A. So we'll take your questions about any of these subjects or others and go from there. So the first thing is supportable technology, and the little blurb we wrote here is, I don't need to run a vulnerability test on a Windows XP machine. I know it's vulnerable. Windows XP is not a supportable product anymore. Microsoft got rid of it a few years ago. If you're familiar with the Microsoft operating system lifecycle, if you run Windows 7 PCs in January of 2020, they will be end of life, and we'll be in a similar situation in Windows XP where more unidentified vulnerabilities are going to start getting exploited and can cause serious problems. That's where WannaCry was a big deal a few years ago. But we need to have supportable technology. You can see Charles Steele, one of our engineers here, working with some supportable technology in the background. So first question, is the vendor actively supporting the product? Again, sort of gets to the Windows thing I just talked about before. Vendors are not going to make these things open-ended. They're not going to support a product forever. That's not in their business model, and it's impossible to do anyway. I mean, we have to iterate. We have to improve things. Paradigms change. We have to go with that. So after several years, the product is generally not supportable anymore. I mean, if you have a product in place, any kind of piece of hardware or software, if it's in place for 5 years, it's really worth making sure that the vendor who provided that product is still able to support it. How reliable is that vendor? So, we generally have, Microsoft is not perfect. We like Microsoft, we use Microsoft products, but they're not perfect. How confident are we that when there is a vulnerability discovered for a Microsoft product, how confident are we that Microsoft is going to address that? And the answer is very. Generally, when something is identified, Microsoft turns around the patch really quick. That can't be said for all vendors. And again, we're not trying to give Microsoft a pass. They haven't been perfect on it always. But other vendors are really bad at it. There are known vulnerabilities that exist right now that don't have workable fixes from the vendor for products that they supposedly support. That's very disturbing. A product says, the vendor says, and I'll use Cisco as an example, but I don't think this is necessarily a Cisco issue. We've done an external test. This device has a flaw. Cisco hasn't released a fix for it. Just know about it. Well, I mean, we can know about it, or maybe we need to replace the device. So we need to start thinking about those sorts of things when it comes to supportable technology. Is it an industry accepted product from a trustworthy vendor? So there's a big difference between purchasing an Apple iPhone and some, generic mobile device that runs maybe the Android operating system from a fly-by-night vendor who just came on the scene and, they put out cheap products. And we can't expect that when these subpar vendors put out products that are cheap, that we're going to get the same level of support, or that it's going to be an industry accepted product. Getting back to the Cisco example or the Microsoft example, when I put those products in, I have a lot of confidence that these are trustworthy vendors and they're industry accepted products. The same can't be said for a lot of products that we run into and have to take over support for. And so when we do onboardings, a lot of times we have to have conversations with our clients about, you've been using this, battery backup unit, and, it's just not an APC unit. We have confidence in APC. This is some generic thing we found at Walmart. It's not a knock on the product necessarily. It's just not an industry accepted product for what you're trying to do. Does the feature set of the product match the vulnerability management needs? So firewalls, for example. A firewall sits between your internet connection and the rest of your network. It is a gatekeeper, if you will, of letting traffic in and where that traffic flows into your network and outside into the public internet. But not all firewalls are created equal, right? We could put in a basic Linksys firewall somewhere, which is probably an okay product for your home. But I couldn't put that in a data center. It doesn't have the features we need. It doesn't do the things we need to provide acceptable security. Again, it's not that it's a bad product necessarily, it's just not the right fit. Have we reviewed these solutions and come up with a life cycle plan? So every so often, regardless of all these other questions, there should be reviews going through, basically an inventory. Here's the stuff we have to manage. Here's its importance to the organization, how it impacts our business, what we do. And this one's this old, this one's that old, the vendors here are good, we've had these positive experiences. This is worth review on a very regular basis to make sure that the things we're using are still good, and then also that we're not letting something linger where it could create a huge hole and a gap in our network that bad guys could exploit. Here's a sort of fun fact, maybe it's not that fun. Operating systems such as Windows or Mac OS X, etc., accounted for 38% of the 8,822 vulnerabilities identified in 2015 alone by NIST. So what's 40% of 9,000 is, say 3,500 or so. All of those vulnerabilities only come from the base operating system, Windows or Mac OS. And those are identified vulnerabilities, not unidentified vulnerabilities. And those identified by the National Institutes of Science and Technology, not including things that might have been found elsewhere. So the idea that we can just do basic stuff and avoid vulnerability management is kind of a silly idea. These things will exist. We will have vulnerabilities this year. When I run a vulnerability test for a client, they say, well, do you think we'll find anything? And the answer I give is always the same, which is, yes, we always find something. Even clients that we actively support and are very diligent about patch management, if we do an assessment, we will find something that represents some kind of risk. Maybe it's not a dramatic risk, but a risk. So these things are going to continue, and they're going to last for a while. It's just a matter of how we handle it. One way we deal with this is through a testing and identification process. So we have a few steps for doing testing and identification. The first thing is developing a testing schedule for internal and external vulnerabilities. So an internal vulnerability is a vulnerability on an endpoint. The laptop that I'm doing this webinar on. As a matter of fact, I ran a vulnerability test on it yesterday, just as a part of my job. And it's just an application that runs, and it spits out what flaws were identified by NIST and how they're scored, et cetera. Externally, we can run tests against IP addresses. So the phone numbers, if you will, of your internet connection, that makes a good analog. So from the outside, how vulnerable is the system? We need to know how vulnerable devices are, but also somebody on the public internet doesn't necessarily know what's behind your internet connection. So we run tests on the perimeter to see how easy it would be to get into that. We need to consider mobile devices now. I mean, they have many flaws as well. And here's really, architecturally, when you think about what they do, a Apple iPhone or an Android device or really any mobile device, they have flaws too. They run on an operating system. Those operating systems have flaws. They have applications on them. Those applications have flaws. There's really not that much difference between them and a PC in terms of the way we have to manage them, except for the fact that mobile devices are often personally owned, and they tend to run the gamut in terms of what they run. If you go to an average office, maybe not everybody has the exact same PC, but chances are you will go into a place and they're a Windows shop. They run all Windows 10 or all Windows 7 or something like that, and there's minimal variation. We sort of know what we're doing with it, so everything is centrally managed. Mobile devices are a little more tricky. You need mobile device management solutions. You need to have inventories and stuff like that because they are so disjointed from everything else. So we have to be considering of them when we're doing a vulnerability management plan, especially if those devices have touch on sensitive data. So all of these vulnerabilities that we talk about, whether they're internal, external, mobile devices, whatever, these vulnerabilities can be measured for things like severity, likelihood, and impact. So severity is the idea of, well, if somebody took advantage of this vulnerability, how damaging could it be? There's vulnerabilities that NIST identifies that, for example, tell a bad guy what the time is, what the server thinks the time is. Well, I guess that's a vulnerability, but that's a little bit different than a vulnerability that allows someone to go in and inject code and actually install a virus or something like that. These two severities are dramatically different, and we have to treat them differently in terms of how we manage them. Typically, we try to fix everything. We try to address all vulnerabilities, but sometimes the juice isn't worth the squeeze. To make the change to the vulnerability, we have to break our entire system apart. The severity isn't that big, so maybe we just let that one slide. This is, again, part of the process of testing and identifying. Another measurement we use is likelihood. So maybe something is very severe in terms of what could happen, in terms of how deep someone could go into it, but it's just not that likely. It's so hidden. It's got there's another mitigating security factor that makes that vulnerability not so relevant. We've already protected it from something else. Let's say think of an example. We want to, it's like the panic room, right? So we have a panic room, and the person in the panic room is very vulnerable, but it's not very likely you get access to the panic room because the panic room is designed to mitigate that. Impact is another one. So what is the impact of the organization? Maybe something is low risk and high severity, but the impact of the organization is so great that we have to address it. If somebody takes advantage of this exploit, we will no longer be a business. If somebody takes advantage of this exploit, we're going to have to talk to the federal government about what happened. Those types of things, if they're very impactful, some of those other measures might not even matter, and it means we have to come up with a system management plan for it. As I mentioned before, these things can be difficult to fix. You kind of have to try. I mean, what you look at is we've got this big mountain of stuff that we have to deal with, and we want to do the best we can to get rid of them. We can't get rid of all of them. The ones we can't get rid of, either we have a systems management plan for, or a mitigating risk factor, or something, or at least know about it, so that when it's exploited, or if it's exploited, that we have a way to deal with it. For example, that a vulnerability to your home is that you might have a house fire. Well, that's a vulnerability that exists. I don't know of any sort of thing I can create that prevents the home from ever being lit on fire. Unless it's maybe a stone house or something that just can't catch on fire. But that this is a vulnerability, so you put in smoke detectors, and you have a fire hydrant on the corner for the fire department, and you've got fire extinguishers in your house and all that other stuff. You can't fix the core vulnerability, but what you do is you try to mitigate it. The point is by going through all of these four items and looking at what's here, and testing it, identifying it, measuring it, et cetera, and coming up with plans, we're just lowering our risk entirety just because we know what we're dealing with and we're prepared. I'm going to pivot a little bit and talk about patch management, because this is a really critical part of vulnerability management and testing. One thing I can say is that when I do vulnerability tests, there is a difference between the results that I get for a client that we have that is fully managed, that is on our Confidence Plus agreement, where we're doing patch management regularly, they have supportable items, etc. We still find vulnerabilities, but the volume of these vulnerabilities and the impact and severity are just so much less than somebody who I've never even spoke to before. They have a limited systems management plan. They don't really do that much work. Maybe they don't have patch management, or they have an insufficient patch management solution. Those tests tend to be a lot worse, and they have much higher levels. So one thing I can say is that if you don't have a patch management plan right now, you really need to get one, because without running any tests, I can say that someone who does have this is a lot better off than someone who doesn't. So a few things you should know. Patches fail. We cannot take patch management for granted. But then Microsoft says that everything's automatic, and my machine will reboot, and this security patch will go in, and that's all great. But the truth is that these automatic systems don't always get the job done. The download of the patch fails. It doesn't apply right. The machine doesn't get rebooted. Maybe there's some sort of crash, or the patch itself is just flawed. We just can't assume that these things work. And I usually recommend that, yes, we utilize these automatic tools to improve things, but what we really should have is a centralized solution that monitors and manages the patches, pushes them out at a regular time, and has visibility on what fails beyond what the core vendors support. It's just not the same type of solution. We really have to allow the patching process to work, which means doing annoying things like reboots and so on. I know people don't like rebooting their machines, things like that, but we have to respect the fact that if, let's say, Tuesday is our patch day, that we know to leave the machines on so the patches can run and then have them reboot. I know somebody said, well, you know, I want to shut down my computer, or I want to do this, or I don't like having to reboot my PC first thing Wednesday morning, but you know, the thing you're going to like a lot less is the consequences of a significant data breach or a hack to your system. The little 2-minute reboot while you get your coffee the next morning might not seem so painful compared to that. Another important thing about patch management in general, and this is a broader lesson beyond patch management, is that we can only patch what has been identified and has a fix. So as I said, there are vulnerabilities that have no fix. There are vulnerabilities that we don't even know about yet because they have not been discovered, or at least discovered by good guys. And there are plenty of vulnerabilities that are yet to be patched. So the point is, even if I ran a vulnerability test for you and I found absolutely nothing, and I said everything's good, we can't take for granted that vulnerabilities don't exist. They probably do exist. And we have to have the expectation that there is more we have to do outside of patching. One thing would be remediation for vulnerabilities outside of patches. So as I mentioned earlier, there's a huge chunk of identified vulnerabilities do get resolved by patches, but not everything. So one great example is encryption standards can become dated and flawed. So I don't know how familiar or how technical those on the call are, but things like SSL certificates, those are things that are used to encrypt communication. If you ever go to a website that says HTTPS at the front, which you probably should if you're doing online shopping or banking or anything like that, where secure communications really matters and you don't want people seeing what that data is. These encryption standards can become dated and flawed. So TLS was an old standard and they went through many versions, and now it's not really an accepted standard anymore. It's not that it wasn't a good product at the time, but it's just dated and flawed, and oftentimes you have to get new certificates, things like that. So sometimes we have to do things like that, especially on the external side. And again, some vulnerabilities are just unpatchable. The vendor has not put out a solution, the fix breaks something, we have to compensate elsewhere. Another thing that's outside of patches is configuration and system management. A super important one, especially in 2019 with the rise of phishing and social engineering, is authentication policies, procedures, and standards. Things like who has a username. Everyone should have a unique username. Having regular password changes, passwords of complexity. Ideally, multi-factor authentication or two-factor authentication, where not only is a username and password used, but also another item like a token, something that goes to your cell phone, a text message, a authentication tool, whatever it is, that confirms that it's you who's logging in. Passwords and usernames are I don't want to say totally easily cracked, but are very crackable. And so it's important that we have good standards, and those standards fit the risk profile we're looking to meet. And if you're not sure about this, it's really a good time to talk with your technology management company or IT guy or whatever, and have a chat about, well, how do we log in particular, and how do we communicate with some of our sensitive systems, the things that could be most meaningful if they were broken or hacked into or breached or something like that. Those are the areas where we need to put the most planning and sophistication into security. Too much privilege. I see all the time businesses giving too much access to too many people on too many things, including system administration. It's very common that I see people in management at a company who, let's say for the sake of argument, a medical office, where the principals and the big managers, the decision makers are often the medical doctors. But the truth is that a medical doctor doesn't need to be a system admin. Sometimes they take these rights because they feel, well, I'm the owner, I need to have this stuff because I need to control it. But the truth is, at the end of the day, that the owner of a business often does not have any value by having those privileges in the first place. But beyond that, if their account is exploited because they are highly targeted as a high importance person, especially when you consider social engineering, now the person who's taken over that account has way more privilege than they should. It's one thing if they take over an account and they get into that account and they can maybe view someone's email, which is bad enough. But imagine if they can go in and view that person's email and then go ahead and change everyone's credentials and then go in and encrypt all this data that the owner really didn't even need access to, or whatever. We need to control privilege and make sure that people have what HIPAA would call the minimum necessary standard, which is people should have the rights and access to the things they need, and the things they don't have the rights and access to need, they don't have. You should trust your IT personnel to manage the system admin stuff, but the people on your staff who are workers, they should have access to the things they need to do their core job competency, not anything beyond that. Inadequate products. So again, I brought this up a little bit earlier. You know, not all firewalls and security products are made equal. There are plenty of free antivirus products out there that have some value and are useful, but they are not as comprehensive as enterprise level products. Same with firewalls. I mentioned the Linksys example earlier. You know, a Linksys firewall isn't going to do what Fortinet does, which is usually what we go with. There's a lot of good products, but the point is that we need products that suit the needs of the organization, not something that just says, is not just in a product class, but something that fits the organization, fits the size, what you're doing, so on and so forth. And the truth is that I would expect that a lot of people on this call may not have that knowledge. This is why it's important to have a dialogue. Why is this solution suitable for us? Why is this the type of firewall we're using? Why is this the type of backup or disaster recovery unit or managed SOC or whatever? Why is this the solution we're using as opposed to the cheap solution? By the way, sometimes the cheap solutions are the right solution. So overall, when we're trying to design a system and build a system and manage that system, we should be using the right type of product. You can go cheap on, you don't need to have super high-end category 6 Ethernet cables. A decent Ethernet cable is fine. We should be investing the most money into the things that are most meaningful to the organization, and then use cheaper products that just get the job done. Printers are a good example, right? If you don't need, you don't print a lot, maybe you're a paperless office, maybe you don't need the big sophisticated copier. Maybe that money is better spent on security. Poor application control. So every application is one that can be exploited, and we should limit what is installed. Applications are built, they often have access into core systems for whatever reason. And everything you install could be exploited for a virus or whatever. And if we just keep installing and installing and installing and installing things, that's more stuff we have to patch. That's more stuff that can be taken advantage of. It's bloatware on the machine, so it's not going to make the machine run any better. We should generally limit what's installed. I'm not saying be draconian about it, but the truth is that there are a lot of times where we go into an environment and PCs have applications that were in use 2 years ago that nobody uses right now. There's no reason that stuff shouldn't just be uninstalled or removed. It creates its holes and risk that we don't need. And then lastly, unsupported, unrenewed support products. So for example, an antivirus application is in place and no one's renewing the subscription, and the subscription lapses and it doesn't get any new updates. And so now a virus exists that you have no defense against. Or a firewall that is no longer being supported by the vendor and or was forgotten to be renewed. You know, you didn't want to spend the few $100s on it, and now it's not getting a firmware update that someone else is taking advantage of, or the product just doesn't work as well. It's super important for things like firewalls, antivirus, battery backups, etc., that those subscriptions keep up to date. These warranties are a little different than, say, the warranty you might get on a set of tires, a product failure. What I'm concerned about with these products is getting the important updates that the manufacturer has. You're kind of buying a service when you buy a lot of technology products now. Think about Windows. You know, we're talking a lot about moving from Windows 7 to Windows 10. Windows is becoming a service. And so it's important that we keep up our support with Microsoft because they're going to continue to support our product, and that requires some kind of investment. That's what these renewals are all about, and it's super important to do them. One of the other things we're going to talk about before we pivot on to takeaways and some Q&A is defense and response to attacks. So everything we've talked about up to this point has been preventative and management and planning, right? But we can't take for granted that no matter what we do, that this is all just going to work perfectly. We have to have an incident management plan. So the basics are that everyone needs to have these defensive products: firewalls, antivirus, spam filtering, patch management. I'm not going to dwell on them. We've gone through it. One of the best defense mechanisms against attack is your people. So everybody should be trained on basic security awareness. They know what kinds of threats are out there. In particular, phishing and social engineering, which target individuals more than anything else. I would recommend every organization that cares about fraud, that has someone with an externally facing person, and when I say externally facing, I mean has an email address, which is basically anyone these days, that you're prepared to deal with these kinds of threats. If somebody gives permission to a bad guy to do something because they were phished, there isn't a lot I can do to defend that. The user used their privileges to allow someone to commit fraud or a crime. Event logging. So what event logging is think of every little transaction a PC makes. So things such as somebody saved a file or deleted a file, or someone's privileges were escalated or removed, a file was changed, whatever. There are event logs that capture this stuff. Similarly, there's also products that will capture those logs and store them for forensic purposes. And it also moves to the next one, which is managed detection and response, which is systems, and these are more sophisticated, often a little more expensive, sometimes required for compliance purposes. And I would say if you're looking at NIST 800-171, this is a big one for you. A managed detection and response often will take those logs and events. They look at all these devices, the individual actions that happen. So a privilege gets escalated, someone accesses a system, whatever, and it tries to correlate and detect things based on that. Imagine if a system has a new admin brought in. That person's given admin rights. They go in and they remove someone else's admin rights. And then they also go in and they start deleting files. That might be considered a suspicious event. It's correlated by the Managed Security Operations Center, and it gets alerted to IT support to look at it. That's a really good thing, because if that monitoring and sophistication isn't there, we're only really finding out about that stuff once we start seeing consequences. Oh my, where did all these files go? I don't know what happened. You know, they were here today, and now I don't have my rights anymore, and I can't do the things I'm supposed to do. What happened? Well, that's how we have to react if we don't have managed detection and response. And for some people, we aren't going to be able to get there because of budgets or technology or whatever. But if we have a compliance need or a risk need that we need to deal with, it's really worth it to you to consider whether some kind of managed detection and response solution is worth it to your organization. And I would say, if this is something that is intriguing to you at all, it's worth a broader discussion with your technology planning people. Finally, is post-incident review. So anytime something significant happens, let's say we have a data failure or a hack or systems that fail, you know, we don't even necessarily have to talk about vulnerabilities per se, but we can talk about just problems that happen with a system. It's often worth it to do a post-incident review and say, what happened? Why did it happen? How did it happen? Is there anything we could have done to prevent it? What do we need to change in our policies? Is somebody internally responsible for this, or is this something that we couldn't have controlled? You know, we have to know what happened and see where we need to adjust as an organization in order to prevent this from happening again. If we don't do this, we're sort of destined to deal with these consequences over and over and over again. So the key takeaways before we get into Q&A. Risk and vulnerability are inherent to any system and not just technology. So we have to have good standards for managing these risks. We should be building security into design and management upfront. When we're doing a new system or we're changing things around, we should be asking ourselves, what are we doing with these tools? Why are we implementing these things? And what can we do to mitigate that risk? And the answer may be, I don't know, but we may also use this as an opportunity to say, what can we do to assess and evaluate these things? Since we got this new system, what do we need to do 6 months from now, a year from now, to keep on top of the security? It's got to be a part of every technology discussion. It's how security and risk impact it. We should be doing regular assessments to evaluate your plan. And so that might be just vulnerability testing. It might be a full-blown system assessment or risk assessment. It really depends on who you are, but we should be doing some kind of regular process where we can test the system. Is it doing what we want? Is the backup functional? Excuse me, are we getting the results we want? Is it even the right solution? Are we happy with what we have? We need to do this regularly. And if you're not doing some kind of internal assessment once a year or so, you really ought to get on that. Consistent, regular efforts and not playing from behind leads to the best outcomes. Oftentimes when I do assessments, particularly on compliance standards like NIST or PCI or HIPAA or whatever, a lot of times these people are doing these for the first time. Whoops, I don't know what just happened there. The truth is that these kinds of decisions and planning aren't that big of a deal, and they aren't all that mind-blowing when we're doing them regularly. When everything's iterated upon, these things aren't that big of a deal. We're replacing, for example, this year it's April, or I'm sorry, it's not April, it's March 27th right now. We know that in January 2020, Windows 7 is going to be end of life. We really should be talking right now about what we're going to do about our Windows 7 PCs, especially because it might be a significant investment for the organization. If you're making these decisions in December about Windows 7, you're putting yourself at risk. I can say right now, though, there's a shortage on getting PCs. We've had a hard time at times getting hardware to come in, shortages from wholesalers, things like that. Maybe part of the migration doesn't work exactly as planned. We have an application that doesn't want to play with the new operating system, things like that. We need to build time in to work out these issues, and we don't want to play from behind. We need to start acting now so that we have the buffer room to make sure that the outcomes are positive. If we just push it off and let this stuff pile up, then it's impossible to stay on top of. And really, it's just a matter of whack-a-mole, and we're saying, what bad stuff can we address right now? And then there's this other bad stuff that remains. This isn't an exclusive list. There are a lot of things we could take away. This is a very broad topic. There's all sorts of stuff we could go into with this, but for the purposes of this webinar, this is the stuff we wanted to go through. So thanks very much for attending. We are taking some questions right now. I don't know if anyone submitted them so far. You'll see below, here's my contact information as well as information on DP Solutions in general. And we're happy to take those questions right now. So Jill, what do we got?
Okay, thanks, Ben. Yeah, as Ben said, if you do have any questions, just type them out and we will answer them in the order they come in. And we did have a couple come in, Ben. First question is, how often do we need to do a vulnerability test?
Sure. So the answer varies from individual and organization to organization. Sometimes it's prescribed. So for certain levels of PCI, for example, they ask for annual, a specific type of external scan, an ASV scan annually, and then quarterly internal scans. That if you're a PCI level D, that's what they ask you to do. And then you don't really have a choice. That's what you should be doing if you're going to be in compliance. For a lot of organizations, I usually recommend annually. So assuming you're doing good support and you're patching things and staying on top of things, using all supportable technology, doing a lot of things we talked about earlier, you don't have to do vulnerability tests all the time, right? If we're staying on top of things and things are getting patched, I'm not going to panic. Today's Wednesday. I'm not going to, if I ran patches today, I'm not going to worry on Friday, are we still vulnerable? Are we still, we're generally on top of it. We don't have to constantly be doing it. But we should have a regular schedule to do this stuff, and it should be a part of our plans, and we should basically be putting it on the calendar in advance. And the good news about doing these things, you know, one thing I hear a lot of times, especially this time of year, is it's tax season. We got to wait until after tax season. We got to wait until this. But the truth is that a lot of these tests, all of these assessments, they won't interfere with anything. They can be done at any time. They don't impact productivity. They're simply tests. No one even notices them. And it's a lot better that we use the discipline to schedule this stuff. And perhaps we can't implement everything during a tax season, but at least we can assess and know where we're at and know what risks we're facing, because the bad guys don't care what season it is. The bad guys are just going to do whatever they want to do, and maybe even they may even be counting on your complacency because of a seasonal concern. So if you're not sure, you know, I would say annually is the best like, you know, best practice, but I would say that it is definitely worthy of a broader discussion with your IT manager.
Okay, great. Okay, we did have another question come in. What are best practices for end user passwords? Specifically, how often should they be changed, and what should the requirements be? What about tokens? Do you recommend those?
I absolutely recommend tokens. That's where multi-factor authentication comes in. Multi-factor authentication dramatically reduces the risk of a credential being compromised in a very significant way. The token is something that's constantly changing and on something that you hold, unlike a password, which is just an idea, a concept, something that is written down, something that is typed in that could be keyboard captured if someone's got some kind of virus on your machine. That said, even if we have multi-factor authentication, it's worth having good password policies. Here at DPS, and I think this is a pretty good rule, we change passwords every 90 days. We have complexities, so they have to include, you know, symbols, you know, as well as caps and numbers, you know, so it's mixed up. It shouldn't be guessable. It shouldn't be familiar words. The more complex, the better. If it is a problem, to keep these things in mind, there are many great password management tools where you can centralize all this stuff and just click buttons to input your passwords as opposed to remembering a bunch of stuff. And furthermore, you know, one thing I say about passwords is it all depends on the account too. So we don't need, you know, password management isn't for the dumb accounts that don't really matter to us, that perhaps are just for fun, right? That have no sensitive data, that are of no consequence to us if breached. We don't have to have sophisticated passwords for those accounts because we don't care what happens to those accounts necessarily. But certainly for your bank account or your tax preparation account, like your TurboTax or something like that, or your medical records or whatever, those things need to have sophisticated passwords because you don't want that information getting out. And I can say, if you use a simple password, there's a very strong chance that password will be compromised, and someone who's not entitled to that information will get to it. It's really just a matter of time. But number one, I would say, if you're not haven't implemented multi-factor authentication and you're concerned about a data breach, it's really the time to talk about it. It's a little, I recognize it does represent an extra step, you know, using those tokens. But it's really worth it, and there are ways to even make the user experience positive and really not all that expensive.
All right, thanks, Ben. And there is a couple of follow-up questions. What can we do as an organization to help educate our end users about vulnerabilities beyond trainings?
Beyond training. So let me think of this for a second. So educate beyond. Well, I mean, the only way I can think of educating people is by training them. I mean, you could put it on them to get this information. I would also say that aside from training, we should have things like acceptable use policies where we illustrate to our staff why they have access to a computer, what they're allowed to do with it, what they're not allowed to do with it. The data that we as an organization consider to be sensitive, the rules for sharing that information, if there's any special procedures they should be taking to send it securely, like perhaps using like an encrypted email solution or secure FTP or whatever, that should be an acceptable use, and that's important. But I have to say, as it pertains to things like phishing, general security awareness, social engineering, training is the way to do it. Now, I'm not saying everybody needs to go away to school and spend a month learning cybersecurity, but small, regular touches. When I do a training program for our client, we have a portal that we use where we do regular security awareness trainings that are online, as well as phishing tests to try and, actually catch people falling for these phishing attacks in a safe way. What I often do is I will do quarterly security awareness trainings that are maybe 20 to 30 minutes of content for them to watch on a video with some small interactions, and then a quarterly phishing test where they don't know it, but I'm running a test on the organization to see who falls for my fake attacks. I think it really behooves most organizations to consider some kind of general awareness, even if you can't do what I just suggested. There's no substitute for it. But training does go along with policy, and if you set the expectations for what people do, that's a good first step.
Okay, great. And last one, do you have any preventative maintenance recommendations for hardware? What can we do to extend the life of our laptops and other equipment?
I guess it depends on when you say extend the life, where you mean now. As it pertains to the hardware itself, the physical hardware, making sure it doesn't break. I'm not talking about software at all. Obviously, things like making sure that it's not overheating, that it gets ventilation, that it's kept pretty clean, that you're not, messing with that stuff, that you're not jostling it around all the time. That's very important. The truth is these devices feel a little disposable in a lot of ways in terms of, they're made to be cheap. I mean, technology hardware has really come down in price. I was musing with my dad last week that when I got out of college, I really wanted an LCD television because I couldn't wait to get an HD TV, and I spent $1,500 on a 32-inch LCD. And that was something I spent. I felt so good about it. What's a big investment? I can't wait to have it. A 32-inch LCD now is a couple $100. It's nothing. So they're made to be kind of disposable. There's doing basic things like that can help keep these things from breaking, but inevitably they're going to fail. As far as the software is concerned, the software side, the OS side, certainly patching and updating these products and keeping the support subscriptions renewed is very important. But when that stuff ends, there is nothing you can do to make that life longer. When in January 2020, when Windows 7 goes end of life, I can't think of anything that you can do to make that product more supportable, aside from putting in more sophisticated security solutions that will identify when those things are being attacked. So in other words, getting back to that example, imagine if we're February 2020, and now there's these new vulnerabilities in Windows 7 that Microsoft isn't doing anything about. I could implement a managed detection and response solution that will support looking at those devices to see what may be happening if they're attacked. And yes, we can respond to those flaws, but you can see we're kind of not really dealing with the symptom here. The symptom is these devices are inherently flawed. We have to deal with the inherent flaws first and use the managed detection and response, these more aggressive products, to really focus on response to things as opposed to preventing things. There's just a limitation to what can be done on keeping things alive forever. And we shouldn't have an expectation that when we put a machine in, like a PC in, that machine's going to be there for 10 years. I just think that's not realistic. Same thing with a firewall or an antivirus product. We could not expect these products to last years and years and years and years. That's just not the design. Everything in technology is really moving to as a service right now. Windows is going to be a service. I'm mentioning this whole Windows 7 and 10 thing that's front of mind, but I actually think this might be the last time we really have a conversation like this, because Microsoft is really making a push with Microsoft 365, Windows 10, et cetera, to make their services more like, well, pay us this monthly fee and you get all of this, and we're just constantly iterating on the same product, and we're not going to have to redo the wheel when we go from one version to the other. That seems to be where things are going, which in a lot of ways is better for the consumer or the business, because all they have to focus on is keeping things supported, and it helps their budgets too. So that's kind of where I see things going, but it is critical that we have supportable products in place.
Okay, great. That looks like all the questions that we have right now. You want to wrap things up?
Yeah, well, thanks again, everybody, for joining us. I know we talked about a lot. If you have follow-up questions, maybe I didn't answer one of those questions adequately, you can feel free to email me directly. Um, I'm going to be taking a vacation starting tomorrow, but I promise you, if you get back to me, I will get back to you on your response or bring it to somebody who can help you. All my contact information is below. We're going to have next month specifically a webinar about Windows 7 to Windows 10 and Server 2008, because these products are going end of life. We are making a big push to educate our clients about what this means, how they need to think about it, etc. And so we've decided that April is going to be a focus on that. I would highly encourage everyone on this call to attend. We're going to do a little more than usual, I think, when it comes to the webinar content and then also supplementary content. As always, also, if you're not getting the security tips or something that we send out every week, feel free to ping us and we'll make sure you get those tips. It's just nice little chunks that maybe help, better defend you against things and help you think about your technology. And aside from that, thanks very much. I hope to see you all again very soon, and take care.
Okay, thanks everybody. Bye-bye. And yes, Jasmine, we will send you those tips.